expat children in the segment Where Are They Now and What Are They Doing? Today, we're joined by Chiara in Malta.
Hello.
Hi, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, so why don't you start us off by just telling us a little bit about yourself, where you are now, what you're up to, and yeah.
I'm Chiara. I'm Italian, and I've been living in Malta for the past 3 years. I'm a teacher, so I work in an international school.
Wow.
So it's really cool because I grew up in going to international schools, so it's really fun to sort of be on the other side of that now.
Yeah, yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Okay. Where else have you lived then, if you've been to international schools your whole life? Let's dig into that.
Yes. So I was born in Italy,
Mhm.
and we left when I was about 2 years old, and we lived around 2 years in Montenegro first,
Okay.
and this was like in the early 2000s, so just after the sort of Balkan War and everything.
Yeah.
And after Montenegro, we went to Africa. We lived in Uganda for 6 years,
Oh,
so I
wow.
spent most of my childhood there. And then we sort of had a break from these type of places where my parents were working, and we moved to the UK, and I lived in the northeast in Newcastle
Mm.
for 3 years because my parents kind of had a break from their work. They started doing a master's over there, and so yeah, we were supposed to be there for 1 year. We ended up being there for three, and after
That's how it works.
that, yeah, as always, we then moved to Jerusalem
Wow.
for, yeah, and I finished high school there, so I was there for 4 years, and then I went to the UK for university, and then now Malta, starting my job.
That's so cool. Where did you study in the UK?
I did my undergraduate at the University of Birmingham.
Mm.
And then I did a master's in London at Royal Holloway. And then I did a postgraduate certificate of education to become a teacher still in London at London South Bank University. And actually, that's kind of how I ended up in
Cool to
Malta.
hear. What do you teach then at the school?
So I teach, I'm a primary school teacher, so I teach grade three.
Mm.
So everything, math, English, sort
Oh,
of a combination of science, history, geography,
yeah, yeah.
a little bit of everything.
And I'm assuming you like your job since you stayed and you like teaching in general or teaching at international
Yeah,
schools.
yeah, I think it's really great. I think international schools have a very distinct sort of atmosphere and environment that
Mm.
is very rare to find in most kind of local schools in a lot of different countries. So I think international schools have, I mean, it's a privilege to be able to sort of
Yes.
be in that environment, and it's really, really cool.
Yeah. Have you always felt that way growing up and changing schools every few years or so and jumping from one international school to the other? Have you always felt that sort of feeling regarding them?
I think, especially if you ask my parents, they will
Mm.
say no. And I
Same.
think that's sort of the interesting thing about moving around a lot is that it's really not something you're often able to see and understand in the moment.
Mm.
And so I definitely struggled with the moving around. And I remember like my sister and I would always used to say, can we go live in a developed country? We don't want to keep living in developing countries. And we would like fight over who would press the button of the elevator when we were back first of the summer in Italy because we didn't have elevators in Uganda. And so that was like a luxury technology for us.
That's such a
And
niche memory that I relate to.
like, I want to press the button. Oh yeah, I want to press the button.
Yeah, yeah.
But
It's
yeah,
just
yeah.
the small
So
things.
yeah, it is. And so I think definitely no. In the moment, I didn't believe that. I didn't see that. It's very much like a hindsight.
Mm,
In hindsight, I'm like, wow, I'm so glad to have had the experiences I had
mm,
and to have
definitely.
lived the way that we lived because yeah, I think it's a really amazing way to expand your mindset and opportunities and so many amazing things that come from it, but definitely not in the moment. So I think, I
Absolutely.
applaud my parents for having sort of stuck with it, because I think it's difficult when you've got young kids that are like, I hate
Mm.
all of this, and you're like, no, this is for the best.
The tantrums I would kick up, just hearing that we'd have to move again and that I'd have to
Yeah,
change schools again and leave my friends again. Like, props to my mother for sticking through it and just getting us all through these things because
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. It
the
can't
older
have
you
been
get,
easy for them.
no, not at all. Like the older you get, or at least for me personally, but I'm sure you feel the same way. The older you get, the more you appreciate their,
Yeah,
their determination
100%. Yeah, yeah,
for
yeah,
all of this.
absolutely.
It's
Yeah,
not it's not
because
for everyone.
it would not. Yeah, it's not easy, and I think that's what a lot of like sort of couples, at least I know that I've spoken to some couples and like young families
Mm,
that are really scared of like moving, and they're like, oh, maybe we'd want to go live somewhere and do this, but they're like, oh, but I don't want to, traumatize my child, I don't
yeah.
want to destabilize them and all that. I'm like,
Mm.
go ahead, traumatize them a little bit,
Just a
like it's
little bit.
just a little bit. But it's true, I think it's hard, like when, yeah, I definitely have a lot of respect for my parents and what they've done, because it's not easy. I think
Definitely.
especially probably when we moved from the UK to Jerusalem, I was 13 at the time, and
Wow.
that's sort of really the time when your social life becomes really important.
Yeah, it's your whole
And
life.
you're like, yeah. And so I think that was probably the hardest move for me, was
Mm.
that sort of preteen, or I guess teen, um, stage of like, oh, I'm just building a social circle. I now have friends and we do things, and now I'm gonna leave and I have to restart all of that. And
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah. That's the hardest. That is the hardest. Um, so remind me again, I'm so sorry. How long did you stay in Jerusalem?
4 years. I did
4 years.
all of high school there. Yeah, so
Wow,
moved
okay.
there when I was 13, and then finished high school when I was 17, and then went to university. So yeah,
Okay.
four
Yeah,
years
yeah,
I
yeah.
was there.
So what was that like? How would you compare your stay in Jerusalem, which is, quite different, I would say, from like Newcastle or even Uganda. So how would you describe your time there? What were the best parts, the worst parts, the indifferent parts?
I think Jerusalem was a very um important experience, I think,
Mm,
for me. I moved there, obviously I was 13. I had no idea of any of the conflict. I didn't
yeah.
know about, Israel and Palestine. I knew nothing. I was like, okay, we're going to Jerusalem, great, holy
Yeah.
city or whatever. And my parents had a talk with us before, um and their mindset kind of going into it was, okay, like we're going into a conflict situation, big conflict, big deal. But as humanitarian workers, we need to make sure that we're like keeping an open mind, that
Yeah.
we're being very neutral in the situation. And that was kind of the talk that we had before we moved there.
Mm,
And then very quickly, once you start living there, very hard to stay neutral,
right.
because the moment you start living the situation, really being neutral is just closing your eyes to a lot of
Mm,
things that are happening. And for me personally, I I did my first 2 years of high school in one school, which was in Jerusalem. And then my last 2 years of high school, I moved to an IB school
mm,
that was in Palestine. So it was in the West Bank. So
okay.
we lived in Jerusalem, but I used to take like travel and go across so there's a wall
Yeah.
that surrounds what is, I guess, considered to be Israel, and it encompasses all of Jerusalem. And then on the other side of the wall is the West Bank or Palestine. And so I used to cross the wall every day for school, and that means that I used to bring my passport to go to school,
Yeah, yeah.
and that means that when you're on the bus to go back from the West Bank back into Jerusalem, um, you'd have to like go through a metal detector and show your visa to an army soldier. And I lived all these situations that, you're the fact that, like, for me physically, I was to Israelis, I looked like a Palestinian. To
Yeah.
Palestinians, I looked like an Israeli. So I
Interesting.
was kind of like, there's no winning in
Yeah,
that
yeah.
situation. And so there's there was definitely some situations that I witnessed and lived that you can't really stay neutral when you
Of
go through
course.
these experiences and you see what it does to sort of the humanity of people and yeah, it was, I think by the end of my time in Jerusalem, I was like, I'm ready to leave. Like,
Yeah.
let me get the fuck out of here. And so I and to think, like, then when I put that, I'm like, I'm so privileged that I was able to be like, I'm ready to go, and I could go.
Mm,
Whereas to think that there's all these, like, so many people that live there and they don't have that option, like they don't have that choice to go.
yeah.
And I think what was the thing about living in Jerusalem, the way that my mother used to describe it is that she would say it's like you always have someone like pulling on like a couple of your hairs.
Hmm.
It's this like underlying tension that it's like, oh, that's not like annoying, like that's not painful or annoying,
Hmm.
but it puts all of your nerves so much more on edge that then
Yeah.
anything else is going to trigger you immediately because you have this constant state of underlying tension that's just always there. And
That's
so,
wow. That's a great way to describe it.
yeah, I 100% agree. And it's, yeah, so it was a very interesting experience.
I can
Um,
imagine.
and I'm really grateful for it because I think it opened my eyes to a lot of things that I would have never known and I would have never been able to understand and comprehend had I not lived there. But it was very intense. It was
Yeah.
definitely an intense, yeah, experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I I can imagine that it was. But this thing that you said about the privilege that you felt that you like the privilege that you had that you were able to say, well, I'm ready to leave and I can
Yeah,
and I will leave. That's that's a very it's a very I don't know, like a very self-aware thing to say. Like, not everyone
mhm,
has that kind of self-awareness about their privilege. I completely agree with you. Like, I lived in Sudan right before the Civil
mhm,
War, like literally a few months before, and we actually had to leave because of it. And then we went to Tanzania, and we stayed in both those
yeah,
places for less than a
mhm,
year, really. And it really strikes you later in life when you're older to think, well, when you describe it to people as well, and they're like, wow, you lived there, and you're like, yeah, but I got to leave,
yeah,
and it's like, wow, that's not everyone can say that, and
yeah.
it's crazy that
It's true.
we lived these childhoods, and I think it strikes you a lot more when you're older, that you were like, yeah, wow,
Yeah,
I lived there, and I had these experiences, and I witnessed these things, and I don't know, I feel like it shapes you as a person
mhm,
100%, and
yeah.
it
Totally
shapes you
agree with
even
that.
more when you approach it from a different angle, not just, yeah, that was my childhood, whatever, but like that was my childhood, and not everyone has these experiences, but I
Yeah,
did, and I need to, you know, not like come to terms with it, but kind of just like, realize it, come into
yeah,
these memories in a more mature sort of angle,
mhm,
I
yeah,
think.
yeah. I completely agree with that. I think that's, yeah, I completely agree with everything
Yeah.
that you just said. And yeah, I think it's important to look back and reflect and
Mm.
understand like your experiences and what you've lived. And I think it is something that's difficult for people who haven't had these kind of experiences to understand sometimes because you sort of, you're like a sponge and you're a chameleon and you like learn to kind of go and assimilate with every place and culture and country that you live in. And so then it's, I think that also then comes with it with kind of a moral and ethical
Yeah.
sort of debate, obviously, like I'm white and I'm a white person, so I fit into that like white category, and then I have all these experiences of like cultural like things that I grew up with
Mm.
that I'm like, oh yes, I relate to, people from Uganda for some things and some experiences. I relate to like Arabs and Palestinians for some things, and it's like, and it's hard for, I think especially it's hard for kind of like white European or American that have never lived around and lived in different places to be like, but how, like, what are you doing? You're, why are
Yeah.
you sort of doing those cultural
Yeah.
things?
Why are
Why
you
are
saying
you
these
acting in
things?
that cultural way when that's not who you are? Like, yeah. And it's like, oh no, you're not allowed to say that. Like, oh,
Yeah.
that, you're appropriating that culture or something. It's like, well, no, actually, that culture was part of my childhood.
Yeah.
And so it is like, it's a very interesting sort of mix and combination. I think it is important to, as an adult, look back on it and think about your experiences and sort of realize where they come into social, cultural, political spheres and how they shape you as well. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So on that topic, did you find maybe when you were older, maybe let's say when you went to university, did you find it harder to fit in maybe? Because I know you said that we're like chameleons, we adapt very easily. But for example, I found it quite difficult
Mm.
connecting with people at university. And also my last high school where I did my IB the last 2 years, I found it kind of hard to connect with people who hadn't lived the same life as me.
Where was your last high school?
My last high school was in Rome.
Oh, okay.
But an international school in Rome, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So I found it quite difficult to connect with people who hadn't had the same life as me
Mhm.
because just like especially in the UK, like Rome was an international school, so that was fine, but in the UK it was very different, and it's very much like yeah, I don't know, it's hard. It was challenging.
Yeah.
And so the first year for me was kind of like trying to find my place, trying to find my people, and I had to learn to adapt quite hard,
Mm-mm-mm.
quite like drastically, um, to really get along with people and not kind of just like shirk away from them because we didn't have the same experiences growing up. So
Right.
what's your take on this?
I think I had that experience when we lived in Newcastle.
Mm,
So going from living in Africa
yeah.
to the northeast of England.
Oh God, I can imagine.
So I remember that like my classmates and people like they didn't understand me. They were like, "Oh, you have an American accent, but you've never lived in America."
Oh, been there.
And
Mm,
and they were just so confused by me, and they were like, wait, you lived in Africa before this, like what? And they couldn't wrap their heads around like what I was.
yeah,
And so I think I definitely had that experience in that moment. I'd say was that was the kind of the hardest like adapting
yeah,
moment because that it was such a culture shock, and it wasn't necessarily such a culture shock for me, it was a culture shock for them to understand, like to kind of be like, okay, this is something we can accept and we can, involve. It was
mm,
kind of like a, oh my gosh, I don't understand you, stay away from me,
yeah,
what are you, I don't get it. And so I definitely had that experience then. I think maybe because I'd also lived then in the UK for those years. And so by the end of it, obviously I, you know, got adapted and
yeah, yeah,
got involved and everything. And so I actually hadn't thought about this, but maybe because of that, then the university transition was not as challenging.
yeah,
Because yeah, I would say that that really, really hard one was the first time living in the UK after coming from Africa, because that was such a strange situation for them
yeah,
to sort of accept and understand. And so, yeah, I definitely had that experience. But I think university wasn't so bad. Like, university was okay. Um, there was a lot of sort of different nationalities, different cultures, different
mm.
people. And ironically, university is actually when I connected most with my Italian roots.
Oh wow,
Um,
okay.
yeah, I ended up having a really big sort of Italian social circle, and in my second year, I was living with all Italians,
Mm,
and it was so like even my spoken Italian like improved drastically
mm,
during university in the UK, because it was the first time, because I was so used to always hanging around with international groups,
Yeah.
and I never really had Italian friends except for, when I would go back to Italy and I had sort of my childhood friends and family friends, but I never really had like my social circle with Italians.
Yeah.
And university was the first time that that happened.
That's so
And so,
cool. That's
yeah,
really cool. You're really bringing people together at university.
I know. So ironically, university in the UK is when I connected most with Italy and my Italian sort of roots and nature. And yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's also what's like interesting is that like some people ask me sometimes of like oh, but you're Italian but you've lived in all these different places, like do you like, so you don't really feel Italian, right? And I'm like, no, I 100% feel super Italian, and I totally do. And that probably comes down to also like my parents and the traditions and culture that they instilled and brought up at home. And obviously at home we would talk Italian and
Yeah.
we would make Italian food, and food's a big thing for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
and and so like I never had that of like a oh, I don't know like what I am or who I am. I'm like, oh no, I 100% feel Italian. I just recognize that I speak English a little bit differently from
Yeah.
most Italians.
Yeah. That's that's great. That's cool that you kept that root when you were traveling, because I think that's really important just to have an identity at home
Yeah,
at least. Because when you're outside of home, when you're at school, when you're at uni, when you're living your own life, that's different. But at least you
yeah,
have something at home. You have your roots. You have your identity with your
yeah,
family, and the language that you speak at home, and the culture that lives in your home, the food,
yeah.
the idiosyncrasies, everything like that. It's
Hmm.
cool. It's really cool to see.
Yeah.
So do you feel more comfortable in Italian or in English when you speak, when you think, when you work, when you write?
I I am mm, definitely more like well spoken
Hmm.
in English.
Yeah.
um, in Italian, I since university improved like much, but like if it comes to academic work or writing or reading, my Italian is much weaker.
Yeah.
So definitely my English is, having done all my academic life in
Hmm.
English, I'm much more comfortable with it. And actually, my sister and I talk to each other in English. And
Okay.
so, yeah, even though at home we'll talk in Italian and everything, if it's just me and my sister talking one on one,
Yeah.
we'll normally speak in English.
Interesting. I have one last
Yes.
question before we
Okay.
finish. Just you work in an international school, you have contact with parents of international or, national kids. What is some advice that you would give to some parents or families starting out their life abroad and stuff with kids especially?
I would say trust the process,
Hmm.
have faith. Um, they may not thank you now, but they will thank you
So
in,
true. So true.
10, 20 years' time. They will be extremely grateful for the experiences. It's a long time to hold on for,
Yep.
but do it because it's worth it.
Yep.
And I think that would be my main piece of advice is it looks scary, it feels scary, it's going to be tough, but it's totally worth it. And there will that appreciation and that recognition will come. It just won't be for a while
Yeah.
if you're sort of starting that out. And it's going
Long
to be
term.
tough. Yeah, it's going to be hard. You know, I think it's going to be hard to like hear your child, complaining or like being upset and struggling, and you being like, oh my gosh, it's my fault. I
Yeah.
am doing all these things that are causing pain to my child. And just know that no, like you're doing the right thing, you're fine, and trust the process because it will turn around and all of that suffering will not really be suffering by the end of it.
Yeah.
So I think that would be my main sort of takeaway from my experience at least.
I completely agree. At least from my own end as well. I
Yeah.
completely I completely agree. Trust the process. In the long term, it's going to help you and your kid so
Yep.
much, and they
Yep.
will thank you eventually.
and get them to learn as many languages as possible when they're
Yes.
young.
Yes.
That's my other
Sponges.
piece of advice.
They are
It's so
sponges.
easy for them when they're young,
So
so
easy.
just throw them in, like they'll figure it out,
Yeah.
but give
Yeah.
them the opportunities. If you speak different languages at home, like talk to them in those languages. Don't hold back,
Mm-hmm.
because it's such a
Definitely.
wasted opportunity if you have other languages in your roster and you don't pass that on to your children.
Yes, sign them up for the home language of that country.
Everything, yeah,
Encourage friendships with other kids that speak different
absolutely.
languages. Get get those juices flowing.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
Thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us, for joining me, for talking to me. This has been really, really fun, and I loved getting
Yeah,
to know you and hearing your story and
likewise.
everything. Yeah. So I think I'm gonna cut it off here, and yeah, take care.
Thank you so much. It was great to meet you.
You too. Bye, Chiara. All the best.